Hello, welcome to Resilience Radio. I'm Irvin Eisenberg, host of the show and owner of Resilience Occupational Therapy. As always, the opinions on this show are not necessarily shared by me. I like to feature a variety of different perspectives. Everyone has their own healthcare needs, and this is not meant to be medically diagnostic or prescriptive in any way. Today's episode is a follow-up with midwife Erin Mandeville. And in this episode, we discuss trans individuals and birth, class and midwifery, as well as some other interesting things. Enjoy.
If I can add, I was thinking about your last question, and one of the things that it doesn't fit in sort of perfectly to that answer, but in terms of preparing, I feel like, one of the things that is missing in prenatal care in general is actually, very related to the work that you do, your work. I feel like there's a huge opportunity to support pregnant people physically, structurally. We live in a stressful world. We hold tension patterns in our body. When we're growing another human, there's huge shifts that happen. There's a big shift in gravity that puts stress on our low back. There's a lot going on. And so I feel like, whether it's acupuncture, chiropractic, rolfing, PT, these modalities really should be incorporated into prenatal and postpartum care. And so in terms of preparing, there's all the things that we think about, like, do I want delayed cord clamping? What do I want to do for pain management? Do I want a water birth? All these things that we think about. But then there's also, how do we support this body that is growing another human to be able to do that with as much ease as possible? Because so much of the preparation, we think about preparing as sort of all the mental things and the choice points, but birth is not a thinking event. It is very much a visceral, physical event. And so I feel like, the missing piece of the way that we give prenatal care and postpartum care, the recovery piece too, is how do we support this body, which is also a being with a soul and spirit, but how do we support the physiology of this in a way that that understands that it's all connected.
So that made me think about the fact that we have what are the supports the person can seek as far as different healthcare practitioners or yoga practice or herbal support, whatever that might be. But I'm thinking about sort of the culture of how people support pregnant people in their community, family and community, and what people's needs may vary quite a bit. And I'm just curious if you could speak to any thoughts around that.
Yeah, and it's become more difficult, especially for people who don't live, near their family. If their family was, not everyone's family is a support to them, but for people who have family that are supportive, maybe they moved for a job. And so then and then there's this lack of really that village that it takes to not only raise a child, but to support a pregnant and birthing person through that transition. So yeah, doulas, and if we're talking about a wide range of how people live, we've had more than a handful of people that have housing issues or don't have a home and they're pregnant, and then there are people who do have very stable housing and family, and there's still a need for lactation support, and we do fairly terrible job at giving paid leave in this country. That's another thing that needs to be improved. Many European countries will give a full year, 6 months to a year paid leave for both parents, if there are two parents. And so, yeah, there's just, I mean, I could talk endlessly about the needs for support services, but certainly if someone has the means and the awareness and the inclination, acupuncture, chiropractic, physical therapy, and I think different bodies respond better to different modalities. So, wherever someone can find that entry point into some sort of work that supports their structure and their being in that way is helpful.
And we've touched on a little bit in the main interview, but I know that you have some thoughts on the sort of changing terminology of birth and midwifery and terms like motherhood and such, with a more cultural awareness and recognition of all the transgender individuals in our society. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of educating to be done, and um, uh, and each person has their own journey. I can share, when I became a CPM, and I was sort of called to get midwifery training and be a birth worker. I largely I came into it from different perspectives. I grew up around a midwife who was just this strong, inspirational woman, and I sort of took note of that. And but then when I was 18, I took a class where I wrote a comparative paper, contrasting and comparing midwifery and obstetric care, and reading about like an episiotomy and being horrified and being like, oh, there's we could do this better. So, and just really like the infantilization of women by obstetrics. I really came at it from sort of a feminist perspective. And so for a long time, I was really attached to the word woman, and that, and how the feminine involved in birthing. And when I was, started being aware of so, when I worked in Boston, we had several trans men that were having babies on the floor, and I had to grapple with like what is this, my own sense of like being attached to taking care of women, um and sort of this sense of um birth work as also being women's rights and work. And so I had my own resistance, and grappled with that. And now I feel in no way that it diminishes um, the sense of, let's see, I'm not doing a very good job of articulating what I mean here, of there's pregnancy and birth in itself is such a hugely transformative and vulnerable process, and I have let go of my attachment to needing my role to be holding space for, empowering, protecting women in that capacity. Yeah, people grow people and have people. I'm okay with that. That's great. In terms of all the work that there is to be done, it's daunting. The training and just the resistance, people are resistant to change, and but
Well, I think you spoke to feminism coming from a place of supporting women and vulnerable who have been put in a vulnerable infantilizing position, and sort of finding the empowerment in that, and then for people who are invested in that idea of feminism to then be extending that same in the case of the trans men. Here are what we would think of as the most woman-like thing you could do, right? Which, of course, that's a weighted statement in and of itself, because you can still be a woman and not give birth, like, obviously. But
Absolutely, right. It goes both ways.
but here's this extremely, like, if anything is defining as a woman, it's like giving birth, you'd think. But then I could see that being challenging to an identity of womanhood and feminism, and it's complex
Yeah,
because
but that's great. I mean, at the end of the day, I love the challenge because, again, these are all social constructs. These are all, we want to hang our hat on something and call it good, but that's not life. That's not how things work. There's a lot of different ways to be human on this planet, and really, I get, it. I don't want to use cliche language, like it warms my heart, but if there's a real sense of heart heart opening and this flood of joy when in any moment you expand your mind and your heart and your being to include a larger definition of what it is to be human. And so I would just, yeah, I mean, the joy that it's brought me, I would just encourage anyone feeling any resistance to just, breathe into that resistance a little bit and expand, because there's joy. There's joy in embracing everybody.
On a similar topic, but not directly related, sort of the sort of classism and economic well-being, and sort of classical hospital births versus midwifery hospital births and home births. Can you speak to sort of class and birth a little bit?
Yeah. Yeah, that's another area that really needs some big change. So for a long time, home birth is kind of, the pendulum swings, as we'll say. So, um, for and it's different regionally too, and depending on what era we're talking about. But for a long time, home birth was the norm, and then we moved towards this push towards hospital birth. There were, the politics of these major slur campaigns run against particularly immigrant midwives. They would take these pictures of, an Italian midwife with a headscarf and wrinkles and maybe a wart, and say, like, do you want this witch catching your baby, or do you want to be in this clean, sterile, pristine environment with a physician? They just ran these, yeah. I mean, the history is appalling, really. um, so then for a while, home birth was seen as, like, only poor people who can't, don't have access to a hospital would have a home birth. And then the pendulum, and I'm really simplifying because there's been there's a lot of nuance to this. But and then more recently, it was only people that could afford to hire a home birth midwife that were able to have access to that. And now that is slowly changing. There are a lot of insurances and it's different state to state, but that will cover the cost of a home birth. And then there's cultural barriers too, to what your options might be. And then, I mean, then a whole nother topic, right, is just the, maternal mortality, and morbidity for both Black mothers and Black babies. And that, there's a lot of really important work being done, but that there's still a huge disparity there, which is, a huge problem. It's hard. I feel like, that the answer to these questions could be a whole nother podcast in and of itself. Um, but yeah, there are barriers. There are cultural, systemic, financial barriers to having a home birth at this point for some people.
And I think something you had mentioned to me in the past was that there's also barriers to being able to be a home birth midwife. Is from a
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, right now, um, the amount of time, so and again, this is like a larger conversation, but there are accredited schools where you go and maybe it's a 2-year program. Often, and this is changing too, oftentimes they're not ACE accredited schools. It's hard to get loans for those schools. There are some now that are. All this is sort of changing. Back when I was in training, there were even more limited options. But and depending on what state you work in, you may or may not be reimbursed by insurance. You don't, you're not, it's not a job with benefits and paid time off. And many, for a lot of people for a long time, it was sort of wealthy white women with a partner who had a job who could sort of support, and they got to sort of do midwifery, not on the side. I mean, it's a lifestyle, but it certainly wasn't necessarily they weren't the main breadwinner in their family. And as reimbursement changes, as licensure changes, as that all changes as well. And there certainly are people, that made it their life and weren't wealthy going into it, but really it devoted their life to it. We used to joke that the divorce rate among midwives was very high because people just weren't around, really. They were constantly at births and taking care of birthing people.
Well, I think we covered a lot of territory in the bonus questions there. Is there any questions you wish I had asked?
I don't think so. I think it's challenging to do. There's some great questions, and it's challenging to do justice to them because it is difficult to have a simple answer, because the nature of this work is so tied into all of the things in our culture that are stacked against this work. And um, uh, and I mean, tackling topics of racism, transphobia, inequities between men and women, the medical, the hierarchical medical pecking order, and insurance is valuing obstetric. Everyone knows obstetrics loses hospitals money. It's, we're not, with all the technology involved in a hospital birth, we're not doing robotics, we're not bringing the big bucks in. So it's hard to sort of tackle these topics and even answer questions about a particular person's experience of pregnancy and birth without incorporating all the like systemic factors and the nuance of that come into play. So no, I don't think there's any other question you could have asked. I think it's more that it's in choosing the answers, it's hard to fully capture the complexity. My answers, it's hard to capture the complexity of all the issues that we talked about.
Thank you for listening to Resilience Radio. If you want to subscribe on the podcatcher of your choice, you can get a new episode every week. Thank you to Erin Marcus for providing the music for this show. You can check the show notes for full credits on that. I hope you enjoyed listening. Take care.